button. Okay. So we are just at 7:30. Thank you, everyone who has joined with us. I see we have about 11 people on the call. Just so you know, as you come into this Zoom call, I am going to be muting you. And if you have questions, please post them in the chat room. But I'm Shannon Muller. Welcome tonight to our second virtual tour of the Brumos collection out of Jacksonville, Florida. We are very grateful that Brandon Starks and his audiovisual support, Hannah, are coming to us tonight from their awesome showroom. And him and Lester are going to have a great discussion on history, new exhibit, and some specialty cars. So I really look forward to tonight. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and I'm gonna just kick it straight to Lester and Brandon.
Great. I just wanted to echo Shannon's thanks. Brandon, appreciated staying late, doing the tour for us. We really enjoyed the first time around. And if folks on the line joined us back then, we were pretty much in the thick of things with COVID. These guys opened up in January, COVID shut everything down in March, and obviously shut everything that we did down. But in June, if you all recall, we actually had a terrific tour that Brandon had led of the museum, of the Brumos Museum. Highlighted some really nifty cars, focused on the race cars, the 70s race cars. We focused on a 917K, we focused on 935, an RSR. So what we wanted to do was kind of do a little bit, do something a little bit different this time around, so we're not repeating everything. So I think Brandon will walk through a little bit of a different history, which is kind of more about the collection and the guy that really is the person behind the entire Brumos collection, Dan Davis, as well as focusing on a couple of different cars. So we'll focus on a 997 Cup, a 991 RSR, as well as the Porsche Indy car back from, I believe, 1990. So I think that'll mix things up a little bit. And in terms of housekeeping, just shoot questions into the chat room, and I'll try to monitor that as we go along. And I can work that into the conversation and Brandon's tour. So with that, I'll toss it over to you, Brandon. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. You know, it's an honor to be asked to do this. It's kind of one of the most fun things that we get to do. It's kind of our reason for being. So it's neat to do it remotely. You know, it's been a minute since we've done a digital one, so just bear with me as we go through it. But I'll try to keep it somewhat interesting. And with that, you know, it's there's a lot of history here. So I think, you know, you mentioned the 1990 Porsche Indy car is the car we're going to talk about. You know, that's actually almost 100 years newer than our oldest car. So we have lots of cars and lots of histories to talk about. So just bear with me if my recollection needs a minute. We have a lot of important history to span, and so I do my best with it. But hopefully it'll be interesting for everyone. And I'm glad you asked me to kind of talk about the history of the collection itself and how we came to be. The Brumos history is a long one. It started, you know, in 1953. A book was just finished about Brumos. It's called Brumos, an American Racing Icon. Sean Cridlin, who wrote the Hurley book, wrote that. And it's 3 volumes thick. It's like 2,400 pages long. And so that's a difficult history to kind of encapsulate in a small format. And so, you know, if anyone's interested in learning more about the Brumos history, you can definitely find it there. And I'm here if you have any questions about that. But it is kind of a unique question to ask more about the collection itself and collecting cars, because that's something that I think a lot of people are curious about. And so for us, it's kind of the byproduct of a passion for cars. You mentioned this is kind of where we are now is Dan Davis's collection and his creation. This building itself that houses it is 35,000 square feet. It was purpose built to do this, and it's really kind of a neat honor and a new experience for us to share all of these things. So the collection itself, it really began back in the early 90s. Kind of fast forwarding in history, a guy named Bob Snodgrass, who had been brought in to run the retail side, the business side for Peter Gregg in 1972. He stayed around through Peter, and then Peter's wife Deborah owned the dealership after his death throughout the 80s. When she was ready to get out, Bob kind of wanted to continue the Brumos traditions and carry it on. So he approached kind of a local businessman named Dan Davis to go in and purchase the dealerships with him from Deborah. Dan was mainly one of Bob's better customers at the time, and kind of had his own kind of passion for cars. His day job was he ran Winn-Dixie supermarkets, and was not at all related to the automotive industry. It was just kind of a passion of his. So Bob asked him if he wanted to get together and purchase Brumos, which Dan agreed to. I think their running agreement was Bob wouldn't teach Dan how to sell groceries, and Dan wouldn't try to teach Bob how to sell cars. And that's kind of how they operated while Bob was there. And that's where it all kind of started. And so the first car in the collection is actually our 935 back there. It was actually part of the transaction that occurred when they bought Brumos. And kind of over the years, because they were both just passionate about cars, they would kind of acquire different cars, things that they wanted to collect. At first, mainly kind of Brumos related cars, our 91710, we have a 550 Spider. They started kind of piling up in what we had as a secondary race shop that was in Main Street, where the original dealership was. And by 1997, they kind of made the decision that they needed to move the race shop to Atlantic Boulevard here in town, where the main dealer operations were, and then also have room for the collection of cars. So they built, it was probably a 10,000 square foot room adjacent to the race shop, where we were actively maintaining the race cars. It was kind of nondescript. You would walk in, and it was kind of an awe moment, because you wouldn't expect to see what you saw when you walked in. But when they first started, they had a few cars, but there was all this empty space. And Dan said to Bob, "I don't know how we're ever going to fill this place up." Bob said, "It'll be okay." And the story goes about 8 months later, Dan opened the door and they could barely move around. And he told Bob, "Hey, Bob, you got to quit," because they filled it up so quickly. And Bob had a smart idea. So even when you collect cars, you almost need a stocking plan, or an idea of what it is you want to collect. So Bob's idea was cars of the decades, and so really he eliminated nothing about worth that they wouldn't collect. So they had just kind of a wide variety of stuff, and it was all kind of crammed in there, and it kind of ebbed and flowed over time depending on whatever their passions were.
Brumos.
And throughout time, it kind of developed this reputation of the kind of the worst kept secret, and people would kind of make a pilgrimage to Jacksonville and hope to get in to see the collection. And sometimes it worked out, sometimes it didn't. But really, it was just kind of an invitation only thing. When Bob passed away in 2007, some of the cars that he owned went to his estate, others were kind of sold. And so then Dan started really kind of curating more of what became today's Brumos collection, which included not just our Porsche cars, but he really started getting heavily involved in some older cars, kind of anchored by our first Miller race car. It was a 1923 Miller 122. And that, I call it kind of the gateway drug of cars. From that, we've got a whole separate collection basically within this building that are anchored by that car and have some kind of tie to that lineage. And Dan's done an amazing job of becoming really a caretaker for a good portion of that history. He really does see himself as a steward of these histories and what are basically artifacts. And in owning them, he sees himself in a lot of ways as a caretaker for the next people who will eventually own the cars. So where we are today, essentially, believe it or not, there's a group out there that kind of monitors car collections. It's called the Collector Car Trust. They're based out of Europe. They do an annual publication called The Key Magazine, and they actually rank these private car collections. We're ranked number 13th in the world for last year in terms of the significance of cars. We're blessed to have basically the all-star team of cars. Anyone we look at would have the right to be its own kind of, anchor car in its own collection, because they're all kind of significant in their own way. And so that's kind of the foundation of where we are now. One of the common questions we get is, are we looking for cars? There's a certain point you've reached that I've noticed that once you kind of hit a certain point in your collection, cars come looking for you. It's not uncommon to get offered multiple cars a week from different places with different stories. One of the unique things that we do is we focus mainly, as you can tell, on race cars. And race cars for us are important because oftentimes that's where you see a lot of the innovation and technological advancement and attempts at evolution taking place. So that's kind of the earliest place that you see it. And so that's kind of the fascination for us with collecting race cars is you really see the early point that these technologies were kind of tried and experimented with, and sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed. And so that's what we really like. But the challenge that comes along with a race car is that oftentimes it's not uncommon for a race car to be wrecked. And so it's easier to kind of make this point with some of our older cars. You can actually see the frame rails, but say that this RSR next to me was completely wrecked at a race, and so 30 years from now, someone comes across the discarded tub, but this car's already been redone and is sitting here. It's not uncommon for someone to take that discarded tub and to then create a new car. And so then you're in a situation where it becomes, what's the real car? And so you see that kind of a lot. So when we're buying cars, when we're looking for cars, you're looking for kind of a clear chain of custody, really, of where that car has been, where it's kind of widely accepted to be the car within kind of the historical community and the collector community. And those are some of the things we flesh out. I think everyone's heard of these stories of barn finds lately. Kind of our view is a lot of times a barn is a great way to whitewash missing history. So you got to be very careful with some of those things. And especially as, kind of collectability goes up. I think I'm going to paraphrase a quote that I heard Bill Warner, who ran the Amelia Island Concourse, said one time, but the essence of it's very true. I'll probably butcher it. But he was talking about, he said, there were 25 917s to begin with. And he goes, and sadly, only 37 remain today. And that is really, something that we deal with. And it's funny, but it's very much something that we have to be aware of as we collect. So the answer is no. We're not actually actively out looking, but I can say that with that, we've had 3 cars that we've purchased in the last 12 months already. And that's after I've said, no, we're not buying any more cars. So it's, again, they have kind of their ways of finding us. Kind of the March 90P, the IndyCar that we'll talk about tonight was a prime example of how that kind of discussion happens, how that decision making happens. Our other collection of cars really does have a kind of an IndyCar focus, and so one of the things that had been brought to our attention and that we've noticed is Porsche participated in Indy, but we don't have any examples of those cars. And so when this car came up for sale, it seemed kind of a logical mix to kind of tie in the IndyCar focus that we have in our other collection to the Porsche side. And it's and as we've kind of gotten to know the car and learned about the car, it's kind of broadened our knowledge of Porsche in general. So that's kind of how some of those purchases take place. I'd be happy.
Brandon, are you allowed to share what 3 cars you recently purchased?
Yeah, so the IndyCar, the 90P, March 90P, we have a 1959 Epperly that we just purchased. And then the third one, I'm blanking right now. Oh, the third one we haven't talked about yet, but there's a third one that will be. Stay tuned. But they just kind of, oh, I'm sorry. The third one that I was thinking of was we're having another car constructed, an art car that kind of, we have a car that was built by a guy named Dan Webb. It's Webb Automotive Art. He has a golden submarine tribute car that we have up front, and it's just like a crowd favorite. So historically speaking, it's probably, you know, there's not a ton of history to it, but from a kind of workmanship and interest standpoint, it's stunning, and people just love it. And so he's actually building us a artistic tribute to a salt flats belly tanker racer, you know, a P37 belly tanker. So. And if anybody's interested in following that build, if you look up Dan Webb or Webb Automotive Art on social media, I think he's doing a good job of documenting that build process. And with that, I'll take any kind of questions that there might be about collecting or our collection.
I don't see any pop up on the chat room. So folks on the line, if you do have any questions, just type it all in, and I'll kind of manage that and curate that and take it over, send it over to Brandon. Have you sold any cars recently?
We have a bad habit of that. Yeah, we're not good at that part. We did a few years ago. The way we've kind of got it nailed in now, where when we add things, it's stuff that kind of makes sense, and so nothing is here indefinitely. You know, everything kind of, like I say, nothing ebbs and flows. A few years ago, we did have kind of quite a few that we sold, whether they didn't make sense with the collection or they were duplicates. You know, we sold a 918 Spider. We had two. There's no need for two of those, and so one of those went. We had a couple road cars that we had, a 914 with really low mileage, a 964. So just kind of stuff that didn't make sense at the time has been sold off. But right now, the core of it hasn't really been sold. We're at about 70 so cars. And we're not, again, actively looking, but it's a bad habit, and they end up kind of finding you.
So slightly unrelated question. There was a question about how often Hurley stops by.
Oh, Hurley, he comes by at least a few times a month. It just depends. He doesn't have a fixed schedule, but I think that's kind of the way he likes it now. He's kept a pretty busy life, but you know, it's not uncommon for him to be on the way to the doctor and just pop in. And he's around quite a bit. It's good to see him.
Cool. All right. So it looks like we don't have any more questions. So why don't we go to the cars?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and take a look at our Indy car. I wanted to pick, I picked this car to look at because it's not something that a lot of people have really know a ton about. And it was even something that I needed to kind of brush up on when we got the car, because Porsche's kind of Indy experiment, for lack of better words, or attempt at running Indy was kind of fairly short-lived and not entirely successful. But it was kind of fairly interesting, no less. So it really began in 1986 and was spearheaded in a lot of ways by Peter Schutz and Al Holbert. They recognized that Porsche's biggest market was the United States, and the Indy was still one of the biggest races in the world. You know, it's not uncommon to have 300,000 plus people there, and everyone in the U.S. knows what Indy is. So it was kind of a way to speak to the American market through Porsche. And at the time, they were having just enormous success internationally and internationally with sports car racing, and then also in the Paris-Dakar rally racing. And they were supplying engines to the TAG F1 team, and so they were really just kind of having a lot of success. So it made sense to them that they come and try to race Indy cars. And so they started. They made the decision to do it, and really when they started, they did it the hardest way possible. They wanted, whereas March and Penske kind of had the dominant chassis at the time. Porsche wanted to come in and build their own chassis and their own engine and put their own individual package out. And that was an attempt that kind of started in 86 and then 87. Ultimately, it didn't prove to be successful. There's a little bit of debate on if it received enough time to fill in. And so ultimately they went to March chassis and fitted their V8 Porsche engine in it. It's basically 2.65 liter V8 engine. Metzger designed the engine. Peter Schutz, his idea was that it kind of made sense because if the motor worked for Indy with the design of the engine the way it was and kind of the turbo boost characteristics of it, it would be something that might be applicable to some of their front engine cars at the time if it were successful. Never quite panned out, but it was a strong motor, and they started to experience a little bit of success, mild success in 88. They won their first race in 89, and then the 1990 season was coming, and they realized that there was a rule that they might be able to exploit. And so up until this point, up until from 86 to 80, basically 86 till 90, the cars were required to have an aluminum honeycomb kind of bottom part of the car, and the rest would be carbon fiber. They did that for safety reasons. Porsche caught wind that if you had a design that you could prove safety data on, then they would accept a full carbon car. So Porsche and March designed this 90P, which was their last Porsche Indy car, and they designed it from the ground up to be a full carbon car. Well, Penske and Haas Racing caught wind of what they were trying to do. I think that they were at a point where they couldn't catch up technologically. So in the kart series, actually the owners of the cars were actually stakeholders in the series. And so miraculously, the rules changed where all carbon wasn't allowed. So at the last minute, Porsche had to go back and redesign this car. They actually raced the 89P, the year prior car, in the first few races of the season, and spent the last few races kind of shaking it down. I mentioned before, for us, some of the fascination is with not just the cars that succeed, but then also some of the cars that don't succeed and things that they tried. And so for us, this is one of those things that's kind of symbolic of that. After this season, Porsche backed out of IndyCar racing, and it might have been the first time they've ever just kind of left the series as failures, and kind of never looked back. But some interesting stuff with it. It's Porsche wanted the turbocharger design to be in front of the engine for better kind of weight displacement and to allow for a certain exhaust design.
Yeah, that's what struck me as kind of interesting when you looked at the engine bay, which is the exhaust manifolds are all pointing forward.
Yeah. So, it's a real unusual thing. Another thing that bit them in this year, this is a pop-off valve for the turbo. And the 89P and in earlier engine formations, they were able to situate this pop-off valve kind of toward the back, so it wouldn't catch the wind so much, they didn't pop so easily. There's another rule that was changed on them. So it was like the whole rule package changed against them. The other interesting thing is, I don't know if you can focus on this part. It's really a neat way you can see also it had ground effects aerodynamics. So unlike the N962s and 956s they were running at the time that were ground effects cars, you can actually see the shaping of it here through the back. That looks almost exactly like the tub from our 962s for the air channeling underneath the car.
Now, Brandon, was this car just not competitive versus the stuff that Penske and all these other guys were running at the time, or what was it that kind of just didn't work?
Well, this car was not competitive because it wasn't designed for the weight that it was pushing around by the time it was allowed to come out. So I think it would have been vastly competitive had it allowed to have been all carbon like it was designed to be. But when they had to go back and refix it, they were starting the season halfway with a car that wasn't designed the way it was originally supposed to have been, and then they didn't have any of the testing time that the other teams would have had. And so I think it was just a lot of things kind of against it at the time. And then they lost the enthusiasm of kind of the decision makers at Porsche. And so once that goes, you know, the budget doesn't want to be there anymore either. But it was really kind of fascinating to see, and you know, I've watched a lot of kind of videos talking about Porsche's Indy experience, and to see the kind of the credibility that other teams would give them, and kind of the respect that they got, even though they were entering into a type of racing that they had never done before. You know, this is vastly different than sports car racing, and it took a lot of courage and confidence to step in and try to build an entire chassis and a new engine for a series that you've not had any experience with. So, any questions about the car? One other thing I'll point out while I'm talking about it, the other thing that the car was known for is how tiny the little cockpit was. Teo Fabi and John Andretti were the drivers at the time. John Andretti even made the comment that he couldn't fit his knee pads on like they would normally wear. So when he would finish his races, his knees would be kind of black and blue and bloodied because it was just such a tiny cockpit there, and you're always banging against the side. But if a race car says something is tiny, it's tiny. Those drivers are small. But really kind of an amazing car. And you see the early stages where they're really starting to use this carbon fiber well. You know, the rear wing on the car and the front wing are carbon fiber. Porsche started innovating with that early on with their early March cars, and found that it was dramatically better than the aluminum that they had previously been using. But it was a real display of how the rules can change and really tie your hands.
So Brandon, there was a question about who designed the engine. Was it a Metzger engine, or was it Adrian Newey?
This is a Metzger engine in the car. And there was another engine that Newey may have designed for the road cars that they thought they could put in, but no, these are Metzger designed engines.
Okay.
In here, yeah.
That's cool.
So yeah, and at the time, you know, Porsche thought that the front engine cars were going to be a lot more important to their product line than they ended up becoming, thanks in large part to Peter Schutz and his change of direction there. But you know, when he started the whole company, they were going to eliminate the 911 and go purely to front engine cars and some of these V8 engines and stuff that Porsche is not known for.
Well, we're certainly glad they did not.
Yes, me too. So eventually, I guess with the Panamera, but still, it's they've kind of maintained their definite style. Are there any other questions about the IndyCar?
No, I think we could probably move on to the Cups and the RSR.
Yeah, and then the other cars I thought we'd talk about are kind of the more modern day racing cars. We'll start with our GT3 Cup car. This is a Grand Am spec car that we raced. We won the championship in 2011 with the Grand Am series. We had been closely tied to that series at the time. IMSA and Grand Am were kind of a competing series. We at Brumos had just a long relationship with Grand Am through our racing of the Daytona prototype class before that. But one of the things that happened was people would come in and say, well, when are you going to start racing a Porsche again? And we said, well, we're racing a Porsche powered car. And they're like, it's not the same. So after 2010, when really the 6-cylinder cars weren't competitive anymore and Daytona prototypes, we made the decision to, time the slogan was to go back to our roots and race what we sold. And that's how we ended up back in the GT3 Cup car. And so that was a big leap for us because we've been racing prototype cars for basically the 10 years prior to this. And this was a totally new program for us. So Goldcrest in Atlanta helped us out with the first few races and got us going, and we learned quite a bit. But these cars were really, to me, they're really kind of amazing cars because they're so analog, even as old as they are. This is a 997 based car. You know, one of the beautiful things about Porsche is that this is the same car is assembled on the same assembly line as a 911 you might drive. The underpinnings are all the same, and you know, they're still able to go out and experience some success against these tube frame chassis cars that are built in kind of design and engineering shops and made to look like whatever it is that they're supposed to be, whether it's a BMW or Camaro or what have you. So it was interesting with this car is we ran into a lot of the same problems that they ran into with the Indy cars, where rules seem to perpetually shift, not in our favor, and it became increasingly political. So you would show up at the track one week and you would have something kind of working. The next race you'd show up to and they would add 50 pounds to the car or limit the fuel that you could have, and you'd have to change everything that you'd worked up to that point. So we raced these GT cars from 2011, 12, and 13, after which, you know, kind of the difficult politics of it all kind of led to our last professional race being in 2013. But it was nice to go out with this car. Hurley raced his 50th Daytona 24-hour race in one of our GT cars. It was just really a special thing for us. This is a 3.8 liter car. In 2012, we went to the 4 liter. It was kind of based off the GT3 RS 4.0 that's so coveted these days. But these are just basically, you know, the same kind of highly tuned motors that you'd see otherwise. This one makes about 450 horsepower. The car is approximately 2,500 pounds.
So Brandon, who all was the driving team? You mentioned Hurley.
Yeah, so the main drivers on this car were Andrew Davis and Lee Keane, both Georgia guys, and then Hurley drove during the 24-hour race, and then Mark Lead. Mark at the time was kind of a hot shoe factory driver and was always really great to work with. And so, you know, I'll tell you an interesting thing about the 997 car. So we roll up at Daytona, which is the first race of the year in these new GT cars. And we went through, I think, 10 front splitters during the race. And this little black piece here is, which when you get them, it was screwed in from the bottom of the car, but the car becomes basically totally undrivable when those things break. And they were breaking one about every 2 hours. And so it was a large part why we didn't do better in the race than we did is we didn't know. We hadn't learned the splitter lesson yet. And so you'll notice as it sits now, all the screws are going in from the top. And it actually probably looks nicer than it did when we were running it. So at the time, you also had a choice between 5-lug wheels and center lock wheels. There was a performance difference. We chose to run the 5-lug wheels because you could have more guns, lug nut guns, air guns over the wall at any given time. And then another thing that's always interesting to point out is just how light the doors are.
Yep.
So there's so much carbon fiber just to compensate. Just set that down. Sort of trying to get it as light as possible. Are there any questions about this car?
No, I don't think we see any additional questions. So you said this was 3.8, right? Right, the year before.
Yeah, this is a
the
3.8. We have a 4.0.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting when you get a car like this, you think you just go out and race it. But typically what we do, you end up rebuilding the whole car before you even see the track. I don't know if you can tell from the camera, but just how low you get it sit. You basically get them tubbed out and then you get the wheel up in there. We change out the transmission so it can, with the Hewland gearbox, we changed it out to this RSR gearbox, which was a lot lighter, but it's not an inexpensive upgrade. So with that, what's really also kind of fascinating is, this is kind of at the stage where Porsche starts realizing that dynamically, the forces that they've been fighting with having this rear engine design, with the way the competition is going and each of them getting more mid-engine designs, it just increasingly made it less competitive. And so they reached a point where it's like, what do you do? And so in 2017, the rules kind of were very flexible, and Porsche kind of using the same ingenuity that they used when they developed the 917 and kind of figured out they could make something work, kind of created these GT3 RSRs, which are kind of, for all intents and purposes, I kind of call them Franken cars because they look a little bit, they look like a 911, but it's a lot of stuff that you've never seen before, and they use kind of a variety of parts to get it to where it is. So this is actually a mid-engine car, a mid-engine 911, and you can see back here, if you get the camera up and over, where you have the airbox there, but where the engine sits, that's actually, all that stuff is out of a Porsche Cayman. How they got it to fit there. So it's a 911 motor that's absolutely tuned. You get about 510 horsepower here, but they used a lot of mid-engine parts. There's a lot of parts in there with 981 part numbers on them, just to get that motor forward, to get the car more of a kind of mid-engine balance, and then also to give them room for this rear splitter, which made, from what I understand, just an enormous amount of difference. Is that splitter there? But you can tell, for the way the car is, it's especially, it shows itself in this rear splitter design. It's very unfinished for what a Porsche normally looks like on a racetrack. They came out with another RSR version after this one for the 2020 season. It's got a lot more kind of finished work to it. This one was literally kind of made with different parts from different things that were sitting around the shop. But once they did this, these cars started experiencing a lot of success. 2019, Porsche approached us about with an idea. So we went to Daytona and to meet with them, and they laid out an idea for and asked us if it would be okay to do a Brumos livery tribute car. And it took about 3.5 seconds to say yes. And part of that was just getting the composure to not seem too excited. And so this is what they unveiled to us. So our traditional racing number has been the number 59. They weren't able to renumber their cars, so they incorporated it through kind of adding it to the kind of the racing stripes on the livery there. It was a really special thing for us, and it kind of debuted at Daytona. It was a big deal, and oddly enough, the times it won during the 2019 season were in our livery. So we told them it was lucky and they should do it more often. We didn't get them. We didn't know them bit. So, but really, just a very spectacular car. And one of the interesting things about the car, Porsches have always been good cars in the rain. These were terrible in the rain. But then, as you think about it, the advantage that the Porsches would have had in the rain with the rear engine car is you got so much weight sitting over the rear axle, you got better traction. One of the trade-offs you make with the mid-engine is you give that up. So they really struggle in inclement weather in these things. But
Brandon,
really
Brandon, do you know if they had any issues with like designing cooling for the car?
Not that I've necessarily heard of. I maybe they did early on, but I think it's really okay. They were really durable cars, and not a lot of times did they fall out. There were quite a few wrecks, but the cooling was good. Another interesting thing, I pointed out the rear hatch before. This is typically when it's covered, we leave it uncovered because we think it's interesting for people to see. This is all black, so there is no rear window in the car. So everything's viewed through the rear window of the car through a monitor inside the car. And then it also has a kind of a pre-collision system, so it would alert the drivers if any kind of faster prototype traffic was sneaking up. And then kind of the last other thing that's fairly interesting to me, because you don't see it much, is that the seat here is fixed. And so the way you adjust is that you actually move your foot pedals and floorboard to you and away from you to adjust for drivers. So the seat doesn't move as it normally would. It's the footwell that's adjustable.
And is the steering column adjustable too?
The steering column is not. Maybe it's mildly. I haven't tried to do it. Yeah, it looks like it is. The orange tab here.
Okay.
We had the opportunity to go to Le Mans when the car ran, and it was pretty fascinating because we were able to see kind of the behind the scenes with the Porsche team, and it's amazing the staff that they use on a works team to operate a car. They had a team of 6 strategists just running strategy scenarios during the race. There's individual teams for suspension and brakes and power training. It's amazing kind of the number of people that travel to support these cars. So it'll be really interesting to see when they come out 2023 with kind of this new series of cars, to see what that looks like and see where we go from there.
So my takeaway being a GT4 driver is that I shouldn't feel inferior anymore to like the GT3 guys.
No, I'm also a GT4 driver.
So we tell everybody to suck it. The RSR is mid-engine.
Yeah, mid-engine is where it's at. So that's where 911 is going. And we get 2 trunks. So, but with that, I mean, we can walk back to the workshop if everybody wants to kind of just see a little behind the scenes for a minute, and then I don't know where we are time-wise, but
cool. So if you had a crystal ball, Brandon, as you're walking back, what do you think? Which car do you think is going to appreciate and value the most? Like you maybe separated out race car versus street car for Porsches.
I don't know. There's a lot changing right now because, especially with the technology kind of sector being what it is, I think what you're seeing is a lot of younger people getting into collecting that weren't able to before. And so what they're collecting is what they used to have on their walls when they were growing up. And so I think there's going to be a shift kind of in that, and at least in the beginning, for people. You think you see, a lot of these Ferrari F40s going crazy, and the 959s, and even Carrera GTs with their values going. I think what's happening is there's a younger generation that's starting to buy cars that's buying what was cool when they were teenagers. And so it'll be interesting to see where it goes from there. But I think our philosophy has always been buy what you like, because there's no guarantee in any of that. And I think how much it appreciates or future value is probably the least. That's not really the factor we consider the most. It's more of what the car meant, and the more kind of history that it has, or the more history that it represents, is what we're focused on, because that's the valuable stuff and the provenance.
Right.
So this.
Now you have a good, like with the collection, I mean, you have like a huge variety, right? You have, the super old ones, the 4Runners all the way up to an RSR. How often do they get worked out? Because I understand that all of these vehicles actually work, right? They run.
Yeah, everything runs. And I look forward to a point where we get on a fixed schedule for how often they run. Right now, it's kind of been driven by tasks or what we're committed to being part of, or maintenance. So if we bring it's not unheard of. Here, we'll walk over here. Perfect example is our 550. This has been in the workshop for months now, and it started out with just a clutch leak. And so we've gone through the car totally, completely since then. But as part of that, it's getting run and driven and getting all the work done to it that it needs. But eventually, we hope that we get to a point where we're on a full schedule. I imagine there'll be a Rinsport coming up in the next year or two, and so that'll be a good excuse to get a bunch of stuff out. And that's kind of the way it's been running for now. But pretty often, you got to just be thoughtful about it, because they all run, but you have to put them away in a way that is going to do the least damage to them while they're sitting. So like the Indy car, for example, most of our Indy cars, they run off methanol. Methanol is extremely corrosive and terrible stuff. And so you have to, you do what we call you pickle the engine. So you have to drain all of the fuel out and add some additives so that you kind of stop the corrosion that's taking place within the fuel lines. It's a battle when they sit, so you kind of have to prep them best you can, and then when you go to take them out, there's always something that has to be done.
Now, what all did you guys bring to Amelia Island a couple weeks ago?
So the 550 Spider here went to Amelia, and then the 14 car that's over on the side, it's a 1963 Watson Roadster. It's an Offenhauser powered car. That car also went. So yeah, talk about dual ends of the spectrum. You don't get much different than these two things. But these are the two cars that went to Amelia. We didn't have either of them judged this year, but we did put them out on display for everyone to see. And as part of that, these get exercised before we go and get run. So it's a good reason to do that. And then this June, we'll be heading up to, there's a Highlands Motoring Festival in Highlands, North Carolina. We're going to take our 908 will be there, and then our 935 will be up there. So that'll be an excuse to get those cars out and prepped and ready. And,
now, do you ever do, it sounds like you don't, but do you ever do like demo day events, like Simeon?
Yeah, so we're trying. So we did a dialed back version in February because we were a little bit scared of overcommitting. So we took some cars out and got them started and let people hear them and see that. Coming in the fall, I think at the end of October, beginning of November, we'll do a demo day. And we're lucky enough where our parking lot very closely resembles a track. So we'll be able to get them out and kind of not run them at speed, but people can experience and see them running. We've got a car from 1894 that competed in the world's first ever automobile race. So it might be cool for people to be able to see what that looks like in motion. And kind of, none of these things were meant to be static. And so that's kind of the battle we face. And it's also why we don't use the word museum a lot. A lot of times a lot of times it's a good word for what we do, but it's not necessarily completely accurate. And so.
Yeah, Brandon, last time you gave a little bit of a background on the actual space that you're in.
Yeah,
it's beautiful. I'd love to get there live one of these days. Do you ever do like private events there?
We've done some, and where we're headed, that's with COVID, that's been something that we've battled with. We feel like we have a really special space here. So for kind of evening private events, where we're headed is kind of a membership-based system where we'll have 8 to 10 corporate entities or people that pay an annual fee, but they will be the only ones that have access to the facility for certain special events or meeting space and things like that. It's that's the challenge because it is such a neat spot. Everybody wants to do something, and that's kind of the danger of it because you just don't want it to become done. And then it's not meant for everything too. There's a lot of car themed places that are great. There's some pretty significant items in here.
Is that the web car that you're talking about?
The web car's in here. I'll show you the web car because it's pretty fascinating. So the gold one is the one the web car was inspired by. Let me
okay.
Get this going. So this is the Dan Webb car I was talking about. And so it's really,
That's pretty cool looking.
yeah, it's just amazingly cool. We used to have our Model T in here. And so our building was designed, the design inspiration was a local Ford assembly plant that's in Jacksonville. It was the only Ford assembly plant in Florida. And the building's still there, but it's in pretty heavy state of disrepair. But before we built this, that was one of the places we looked, and the architecture was great. It's an Albert Kahn design building, but it was just too far gone. And this is a picture of that building. So the architecture of our building used that in its design. And we actually have a Model T that I think was on the camera earlier. It was assembled at this plant in 1926, and it's lived in Jacksonville its whole life. So we used to have that in the lobby, but it didn't get nearly the kind of enjoyment that the web recreation here does. So,
But I noticed you're sitting right over the drive shaft, right?
yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'd want to drive anywhere far in this, but it would run if you wanted it to. But it just shows, I mean, it just, you know, I'm still learning a lot about kind of metalwork and craftsmanship, but we get a lot of people that come in that is what they are into, and they just are in awe of what he's been able to do with these cars. And that's kind of part of what we're trying to do also, is just create an enthusiasm for automotive related things. And so it may not, people are into different stuff, and then to just kind of spark that. And this is a good way to show that, you know, you may not be into racing, but if you like kind of other kind of trades and artistic endeavors, there's ways to express it through automobiles.
What's with the engine behind you?
Oh, that's our, that engine won the 2009 Daytona 24 Hours in our rally car there.
Right.
So they would have, the car is on loan and the engine belongs to us. And neither party wants to part with what they have. So it's a bit of a standoff. So we were fortunate enough to be loaned the car to show to people, and we just like to have the engine out too. Those cars were competing against a lot of 8-cylinder cars, and so that made just tons of torque. So our Porsche motors had to run, you know, 10 tenths at all times. We had 26 hours between rebuilds, so you typically have 3 motors. One would be running at any given time, and you'd have a spare backup, and then one would be rebuilt. And so you just kind of kept switching them out. And so, but we ended up with the winning motor.
Neat.
Any other questions that may have popped up?
No, I think we covered off on a lot of good stuff. I'm going to wait a few seconds to see if anybody on the line actually has any additional questions. It looks like it's pretty quiet there in the Q&A chat room. Oh, what's your favorite?
Oh, I can't. That's like picking a favorite child. I have different ones that I love, and they all have kind of like their own little spirit to them. There was an RSR that was back on the lift. It was a 77 Daytona winner. I love that car. Nothing sounds like a 1970s 911 RSR. They sound like, to me, the Tasmanian devil. They're just barking and snorting, and they just sound amazing. We have a blue Peugeot L45. To me, it might be the most significant car here, but it's just amazing what it stands for, and the innovation that took off from that car it really changed.
Is that the one that had the overhead cams?
Yes. Yeah, it was the first car to have dual overhead cams.
Yeah.
It first race car to have four-wheel brakes, dry sump lubrication, 4 valves per cylinder. They developed a subframe for the motor to sit below the frame rails, which was unique for the time. So a lot of the stuff we still use today and brag about today was invented in this car, and it's to me, historically speaking, might be the most important car here. Just a really fascinating piece. I mean, they're up to 111 miles an hour racing around in this, which is, you know, just incredible. We had a driver and a riding mechanic. You can see the sight glasses there. The riding mechanic would have kept an eye on those to make sure oil was flowing to the different parts of the motor. These are your fuel and oil pumps to pump oil and fuel pressure into the car. And it was done before. You think of all the technology that we take for granted today. We had them. The only thing we've done to this car is you can see the number 10 painted on it. So we had that painted on it, and they painted it in the same technique with the same materials they would have used at the time, which involves you outline the numbering and wax, and then the paint mixture itself is actually a mixture of soap and paint to make it more easily removed if you had to renumber it. But one way or another, it dawned on me to kind of figure out why they use wax to outline it. This car was invented 10 years before masking tape existed. So it's pretty amazing, to think of what they created, even with some of the most basic things that we don't, we take for granted today. Funny story, one of the drivers of these cars, they called them the charlatans, because the drivers developed these cars, they designed them. And all the other engineers thought they were radicals. They called them the charlatans. So one of the charlatans, a guy named Jules Gu, when World War I started, mechanics would go off to work on equipment, and drivers would go to become pilots. And actually, Jules Gu became the chauffeur for General Joffre, who was head of the French military during the war. And I've seen it referenced where it was seen as a tactical advantage that the general would have a Grand Prix driver as his chauffeur, because he was able to communicate so much better than the enemy. It's kind of fascinating stuff.
That's cool.
I see your dog's following you.
Yeah, she is. She's good. It's Maggie.
Oh, hi, Maggie. Is that a Westie?
It's a Scotty, closely related.
Scotty.
She needs a haircut. Yeah. She keeps telling me she gave up haircuts for Lent. So.
Oh, too cute.
Hey, Brandon, I think we're good on the questions. I just wanted to take this opportunity to really thank you again for being available, walking us through the collection, and really highlighting the stories behind kind of the cars, which is always the fun part. So thank you much again from myself, our executive team, as well as the region.
I'm honored to. It means a lot to me that people would take the time to do that, and hopefully it was worthwhile. And Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for your time. This was awesome. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure all the folks on the call did too.
Thank you so much. You all have a nice day or evening.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Night, everybody.